Dear listener, has this podcast helped you in your daily life? Has your thinking changed about your understanding of trauma, stress, and living an authentic life? Did it help you grow inner strengths, become a calmer and happier parent? Did it help you become more aware of your conscious patterns, understand your needs, and improve your communication? Did it teach you tools and skills for managing stress, regulating your nervous system, and increasing well-being? Show your love and support today by making a donation. Your contribution in any amount makes a huge difference. It reflects the spirit of our community and what the show stands for. I am asking for your help as I really want to maintain the show's independence and integrity, provide you with enjoyable listening experience, free from disruptions and intrusive ads, and create a self-sustaining, a fully listener-supported show. Your support is invaluable as it will enable us to sustain the show, bringing you new episodes on a weekly basis without interruptions. A lot of invisible work goes into producing a high-quality podcast. There are 3 phases: pre-production, production, and post-production, all costly and time-consuming. Besides conducting interviews, countless hours of research, planning, coordinating, scheduling, and preparing goes into creating each episode. Plus, there are editing and hosting fees. I love making the podcast. It enriches my life beyond words, and I absolutely love our strong global community. Especially when I hear my awesome listeners say things like, "Your podcast deserves more than 5 stars. Thank you, Anna, from the bottom of my heart for the amazing insights you share with the world. I can't tell you how many times I have cried listening to your podcast and feeling a connection to everything being said. Thank you." Or, "This show has been a life changer for me. It has pushed me to grow as an individual and learn how to help my daughter grow. Because of what I've learned, so many of the relationships in my life have flourished, including the one with myself. Although I know I still have room to grow, I know this podcast will provide me with the tools and resources to do so." If you too have enjoyed the podcast and witnessed its value in your life, show your love and support today. Go to authenticparenting.com/support and make a donation. We also have a Patreon page. However, a large chunk of your contribution when you become a patron gets cut off by them. So, ideally, I would encourage you to make a donation through my website, which is authenticparenting.com/support. My deepest gratitude to those of you who have been supporting the show on Patreon over the years. We have 21 active members, and I will always appreciate your kindness and generosity. Thank you. I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the generational cycle of trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, the sleep-deprived teen. If you have a twin or a teen, then this episode is for you. As a parent of a teen myself, I know that teenagers are exhausted, strapped for time, and asked to wake up far earlier than they should. I also know how stressful sleep issues can be, and they are not easily solved by saying, "Go to bed." How can we help our teenagers to get more sleep, wake up on time for school, and thrive? Journalist Lisa Louise, who has 2 teenagers herself, helped spark the first law in the nation requiring healthy school start times for adolescents. She has written a research-based, reader-friendly book called The Sleep-Deprived Teen, Why Our Teenagers Are So Tired, and How Parents and Schools Can Help Them Thrive. Sleep is the foundation of health. It's essential. It affects mental health, athletic performance, academic success, and more. Well-rested teens are happier, healthier, and more emotionally resilient. In today's episode, we talk about the science of why sleep matters and how it changes during the teen years. We discuss the effects of technology and sleep, how sex, gender, sexual identity, race, and socioeconomic status can affect sleep, and practical tips on making sleep-friendly changes at home and in schools. My special guest, as I mentioned, is journalist Lisa Louise, who is the author of The Sleep-Deprived Teen, described as a call to action by Arianna Huffington and an urgent and timely read by Daniel Pink. The book is an outgrowth of her previous work on the topic, including her role helping get California's landmark law on healthy school start times passed. Lisa has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and others, and has appeared on the Today Show, BBC Weekend, and local radio and TV in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and elsewhere. If you have a sleep-deprived teen or tween, and perhaps yourself, I am sure you're going to love this conversation. I enjoyed speaking with Lisa very much and found it super helpful. Please enjoy. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I know, me too. So sleep obviously is so fundamental for our well-being, for our health and functioning mental health. It's, I think, as Matthew Walker says, the sleep researcher, it's our superpower. If you don't have good sleep, it's like you can't live a good life.
Absolutely.
How about when it comes to teen? Why sleep matters for teens so much?
Yes. Yeah. Good question. Well, absolutely. Matthew Walker's work is incredibly important. He is, one of the great researchers out there. And in fact, I do quote some of his research in my book. And I love that idea of sleep being a superpower because it does supercharge us. I mean, if you think about it, you just think about how much better you feel when you wake up in the morning after having gotten a good night's sleep. You do feel like you can do anything. You can conquer the world, as opposed to if you've had a really awful night of sleep, you feel the opposite. And I would say that while that's true for all of us, it is especially important when it comes to our teens. And that's because they have a couple of additional factors affecting them that I think it's often easy to overlook. So the first is that our teens still need more sleep than we do as adults. So after age 18, we need 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and that's a range, obviously, because of human variability. And then after age 65, maybe it's, more like 7 to 8, but 7 to 9 for adults. But teens are not adults, and they don't yet have those adult sleep needs. They actually need 8 to 10 hours of sleep every single night. And I think sometimes that surprises people because you always hear 8 hours as being sort of this magic number, which is great for us as adults. That's the midpoint. But it's the minimum our teens should be getting. So I think that's the first thing, just to recognize truly how much sleep they need because of all the development that's going on during the teen years. The second is the fact that teens are actually on a different sleep schedule than they were as kids and also than we are as adults. They have this circadian rhythm shift that changes when they feel sleepy and when they feel ready to wake in the morning. So that's why, when you've got a little kid and they fall asleep easily at 8 at night and they bound out of bed at 6:30 in the morning and your teen doesn't do it, it's because of that circadian rhythm shift. They're no longer feeling sleepy as early. And that's because melatonin, which is the hormone that primes us to feel sleepy, begins to be released later in the evening, doesn't subside until later in the morning. So teens' entire sleep schedule shifts accordingly. And that means they're not really feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock at night.
I can attest to that. I have a teenager, and yes, she doesn't feel sleepy after 10 p.m. It's like life just begins for her.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's so different than us as adults.
Yeah, and like not by 9:30, I'm out. I want to sleep. I'm tired. I think I read somewhere, I'm not sure if it was in your book or somewhere else, that the circadian rhythm shift in teens puts it's 2 hour shift. It's sort of they go to bed 2 hours late and they wake up. That shift is a 2 hour shift.
I don't know because I guess 2 hours from what? Because they're always sort of, change. We're changing throughout our lives. This happens during the approach to adolescence. Really, the start of puberty is when this happens. And then they gradually shift away from it at the end of adolescence. But it's really sort of more about what time they're now starting to feel sleepy, which again, ballpark 11 o'clock. The other piece, though, which I'm sure we can get into later in our conversation, is that our teens, not only are they not feeling sleepy until about 11, but they're not necessarily going to bed right at 11 because of all this other stuff they have going on, which then, plays into the fact that they are sleep deprived.
Yeah, I would love for you to speak what happens in a teenage brain. That, we talked about melatonin a little bit, that the shift that happens, circadian rhythms, but what happens in the teenage brain? I think that's why they need sleep too, because the brain is working very hard. There are developmental tasks that the brain needs to take care of. It's not that teenagers are lazy or difficult or defiant. I think I want parents to take away from this conversation that there is a real valid reason why your teen is not ready for bed at 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. or even 11 p.m. And it's not that because they are being defiant, difficult, or lazy, and you are a poor parent.
Exactly. And that so often is sort of what people assume. Oh, you just need to be stricter as a parent. Or, oh, well, your teen's just being lazy. And that's not the case. It is this internal shift. Their body clock is on a different schedule. We need to recognize that. But to your question about why sleep is so important during the teen years, well, I should say that it's important across the board for so many different areas, which you can get into, mental health and their academic performance and things like substance use and drowsy driving. But when it comes to teen development, there's so much going on during the teen years. We see them transform from looking like little kids to looking like adults, even though they're not yet adults. You look at 17 and 18-year-olds and outwardly they look like adults, but they don't yet have the same executive functioning that we do as adults. And if you have a teen who's 17 or 18 in your house, and that, just by the way they think about things, and, you'll talk to them and sometimes be surprised at, that they're not quite yet really acting like adults. But that entire brain development process is so key. And this is what's going on during the teen years. It's essentially the second most major phase of brain development after the initial phase of brain development, when the babies are in utero and those first few months afterwards. Well, then during the teen years, there's this entire process of pruning and refinement taking place. So just briefly, what that means is that there's an excess of brain cells that are created when the brain is first formed. And then that excess gets trimmed away during the teen years, and that allows the remaining brain cells to function more effectively. So that whole process of pruning is taking place. The other process of upgrading is one of connectivity. So this is connectivity between those brain cells. So that allows them to process information more quickly. And then there's also connectivity between the brain regions. So this is all taking place during the teen years and primarily taking place when they're asleep, which is why this is so key. And this is not, a 1 or 2 year process. It takes place over several years. It actually isn't even complete until the early 20s. So even at age 20, your teen is sort of at the tail end, but hasn't yet finished. And that's why things like executive functioning and the ability to plan ahead and regulate emotions and all that are not as strong in teens as they are in adults.
Yeah. And if they're getting less sleep, and as the title of your book says, the sleep-deprived teen, which most teenagers are sleep-deprived, it increases all those negative issues, right? The drowsy driving, mental health issues. Can you speak to that, the lack of sleep, the deprivation, the consequences of that on a teenager?
Yeah, well, it really affects everything across the board. I mean, I think one of the things that I say is there is not one thing that any of us do any better as a result of being sleep deprived. But in many ways, the stakes are even higher for our teens because they don't yet have that fully mature brain that we were just talking about. So, what that means is that things like heightened emotions and a propensity for impulsive behaviors, those are hallmarks of being a teen that we as adults don't have to the same degree. Those are also things that are exacerbated when they're sleep deprived. So, unfortunately and tragically, things like impulsive behaviors, that ties into things like suicide. And in fact, suicidal behaviors, suicidality, I should say more broadly, as well as other mental health issues like depression and anxiety, are all exacerbated by being sleep deprived. And so for our teens who are chronically sleep deprived, it's a real issue. I mean, lack of sleep is obviously not the only thing behind mental health issues, but it is a key element.
I think it's fundamental. I like when I start working with the family, it doesn't matter the age of their children. The first thing I ask them about is sleep and nutrition. And they're like, what? My child has behavioral issues. I'm like, we got to look at the basics here, the foundation, the blood glucose level. Maybe drops in your child is acting out in this way. And if your child is sleep deprived and overstimulated with technology and they're not getting enough exercise or they're sedentary and they're eating junk food, of course their behavior is going to be out of control and challenging. And it's not the behavior that needs correction. We have to change the whole lifestyle here, larger picture.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that because these are the basic foundational elements that need to be in place. You're right. If you are not getting adequate nutrition, if you're not getting adequate sleep, of course, that's going to have a ripple effect on your daily life.
And it's going to, I mean, for a teenager, the emotionality rises, right? The impulsivity. And that creates family dynamics between parents and teenagers, really fraught relationships and fights, unnecessary fights. I mean, we all know, from movies and books, the classic teen sort of portrayal of classic. It doesn't have to be that way. And unfortunately, it is very taxing for the parents. They think there's something wrong with their kid or there is something wrong with them. They're missing the mark. And of course, with mental health issues rising, there's a lot of prescription medications. So a lot of the things could be avoided. That's what I'm trying to say. If we take care of the basics, the sleep deprivation in teenagers, they may not need medication for ADHD or whatever type of behaviors. It seems like our approach is always, symptom based as opposed to looking at the root cause and what we can do to help families and teenagers. It's really sad that like teenagers are sleep deprived and it seems like no one cares about this. And there's so much research, it turns out. So I want to ask you this. I know I'm passionate about this topic and I'm excited that I have found you. As you know, we met on Facebook and I'm like, I have to interview this lady. You dove into the research and this was a personal issue for you. I want you to give a little bit of why you got into this topic in the first place, that you're immersed in this passionate advocacy work too. And tell me a little bit about the research that existed even, before.
Absolutely. So, and that's a really good point, is that this research has been around for quite a while. It goes back decades. The first research on teen sleep dates back to the mid 1970s. As you know, we were just talking about the fact that I have a whole chapter in my book on what was called the Stanford Summer Sleep Camp. And it was essentially sleep experiments to look at how much sleep teenagers needed. And that's where they first really were starting to realize that teens are on this different schedule. So this research has been around for decades. It is not brand new. However, making changes based on the research has been a slower process. And when I say making changes, I'm referring primarily to school start times, which is such a key driver of teen sleep deprivation. Because as I was mentioning earlier, teens aren't really ready to go to sleep till about 11. They need 8 to 10 hours. So you can just do the math and you can see why when they're going to school too early, that's making them have to wake too early. And that's basically causing sleep deprivation. So that whole issue is something that hit my household in 2015, because that was the year that my oldest of my two kids was just entering high school. And at that point, our local high school started at 7:30 in the morning, which meant that he had to wake very, very early to go to school. And I should note too that in our district, as is the case in so many other districts, high school started the earliest of all the schools in the district. And that was something that was put in place where I live and in so many other districts long before all this research about teen circadian rhythms was well known. And so at that point, when they were looking to set their school schedules and save, money in the school budget by using just one fleet of buses to do all the drop-offs and pickups for elementary, middle, and high school, well, they didn't know that teenagers are the ones who really should be able to sleep the latest in the morning and have the latest start time. And instead, not having that information in hand, they made the opposite decision, thinking, oh, well, teens are older. They should be, probably better able to handle going to school the very earliest. And even now that we know that that is literally the opposite of the way it should be, so many of those schedules have persisted. I call them legacy schedules because that's what they are. So that's what I had in my district. 7:30 start time for high school. Quickly became obvious that was just really a struggle for my son. And again, not just for him. I was talking to other parents and finding out really how difficult this was for these kids. So as a parenting journalist, I put on my journalism hat, started looking into the issue, quickly realized I had tapped into a much larger issue, that there was this body of research. And I started writing about the issue, and it just kind of snowballed from there. Another key piece to mention is the timing of when I got involved, because I mentioned this was 2015 that it hit my radar. That actually was it turned out to be sort of perfect timing for really helping shine a spotlight on this, because the previous year, 2014, was when the American Academy of Pediatrics had released a very influential policy statement recommending start times of 8:30 or later for middle and high schools, because of the fact that when schools start too early, it affects teen sleep and all the ramifications. So the timing in some ways was perfect. And so I started writing about this issue. One of the pieces I wrote was an op-ed that ran in the Los Angeles Times, happened to be read by one of our California state senators who had a high schooler of his own. So he literally read my op-ed in the newspaper and said, oh, I think this is something I'd like to look into, and, with an eye towards introducing a bill on the topic. And that is what happened. And I got swept up in that whole journey, which is 2.5 years from the time the bill got introduced to when it finally got signed into law. Then there was a 3-year implementation window, and that law finally went into effect last year, July of 2022, just in time for this last school year.
So your son didn't benefit, but your daughter did.
Absolutely, yeah. No, my son did not benefit. By the time it went into effect, he was already off to college. But it did go into effect in time for my daughter and the roughly 3 million other middle and high school students in California's public middle and high schools. And as of today, California is the only state that has a law in effect about this.
Yeah, and there are districts, right, in the nation that in different states. I know someone in Massachusetts, they did so much advocacy work, and it's a very affluent area. They brought in sleep researchers and things like that, and change happened in their school district, but it's not statewide. And I know my state, New Jersey, you told me too, that New York, Massachusetts, and New Jersey are the next ones to get this law implemented.
There are many states, including New York and New Jersey, that have active legislation in the works right now. There are many states that had attempted to pass this type of legislation prior to California. They just had not actually gotten a law mandating, how early is too early actually passed. So those states, New York, New Jersey, I think Texas has one in the works. The other state that actually just signed this kind of legislation into law, but then there's a 3-year implementation window, is Florida. Law just got signed into law a couple months ago, but again, 3-year implementation window means it won't actually go into effect until 2026. So to your point, without this kind of statewide legislation, the change has happened at the local level up until now, which is terrific. And it has happened in, hundreds of districts around the country, ranging from a single school to an entire city. But it means it's happening on a patchwork basis. I think you referenced the district in Massachusetts was a wealthy one. And that often ends up being the case. It's where there is a group of parents to lead the advocacy charge and bring in the experts, and or where there is a superintendent or a board of education member who is on board with this. Because without that, it's very difficult to make progress. I actually started in my own district. I tried that. There were 2 superintendents during the 2 years my kids were in high school, because they're 4 years apart. So I've had kids in high school here for the last 8 years. Neither superintendent was willing to meet with me to talk about school start times. And that sadly is the case in so many districts, where it really matters so much who's in charge there of whether or not this will be successful. And to have it left up to that and to this patchwork approach, really, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, to my way of thinking, is not the most effective way to do this. Statewide legislation really is the way to ensure on a broad level that all the students can have healthy start times, not just those in the districts that are amenable to it.
Yeah, I mean, here we are like writing about mental health, teenage suicidality, everything is rising. But here is one big important key change that could be implemented that can really have tremendous impact in preventing a lot of things. And it's being overlooked. I heard you say in some other interview that the first time your governor vetoed the bill, only the second time. Can you say about that? I find that, wow, interesting.
Yeah, well, it was a change in governors too. So again, getting back to it matters, who's in charge. So at the statewide level, which does seem to me to be the appropriate way, because states do mandate other aspects of education, number of instructional minutes, length of the school year. So this does very much seem to be within the purview, and certainly as a public health issue on par with things like asbestos and lead paint, which states regulate. But in California, and I should also say, this was my first time being involved in the political process, so it was super eye-opening. And I was testifying in Sacramento, at some of these committee hearings. But in California, passage of the bill requires getting through the Assembly and the Senate, and there are committees in each of those, and then there's the floor vote in each of those, and then it goes to the governor's desk. So got all the way through that entire process, and Governor Jerry Brown, who was at that point the governor, vetoed it, saying essentially, it's a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's not appropriate. Well, I think actually one-size-fits-all is appropriate. All kids need sleep. You can't really say that they don't. But that is why then it had to go back, start all over. At that point, we had a new governor in place, Governor Gavin Newsom. He is the one who signed it into law in 2019.
Wow, it's incredible. I mean, we can talk about the problem and these implications, but I think what I want to talk to you about now is how can we help our teenagers to get more sleep? I think the one and big obvious one is changing the school start time, which will make a tremendous difference. However, there are things that teenagers themselves can do and families. So let's talk about those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key thing to mention when we talk about school start times, that one of the reasons for the pushback is just the logistics of making the change. And that so often when you're talking about making change, it means altering bus schedules. It means looking at after school sports. That being said, those are things that can and have been successfully addressed in so many different communities. So the challenge is not to let those kind of concerns override the reason for doing this in the first place, which is that sleep and sleep deprivation is a public health issue.
I agree. I mean, there's this tremendous cost, and teenagers are like a big, large population. They're the adults, of tomorrow. I mean, because of sports scheduling, after school activities, and logistics, figuring out bus transportation, we have to let teenagers suffer. I mean, what are our priorities? I question that. That's like not even a question.
Exactly. It's a public health issue. And I think that often gets lost in some of these discussions. But it very much is a public health issue. And being sleep deprived does have these far reaching ramifications. So that is one piece. In the morning, what time kids wake is largely driven by what time school starts. In the evening, though, what time they go to bed, that is where parents do have a little bit more, I won't say control, but influence perhaps. And so it gets complicated because obviously when you have a teen, you can't just sort of set rules and expect teens to just sort of, go along with it. It doesn't quite work that way. So some of it is having a conversation with your teen about some of this stuff. So you want to sort of have their buy-in, because when you're talking about bedtimes, one of the pieces is helping them figure out a way to wind down for bed, how and when to kind of sign off of devices for the night, that it's not going to help them sleep if they're busy, Snapchatting or whatever app they use to, be involved in some really emotional discussion with a friend right before bed. Like, that's not going to help them fall asleep. So helping kind of discuss all of this. Another really key piece, though, which often influences the amount of sleep teens get, is whether or not they're overscheduled. So again, this is another big topic, and there isn't necessarily a quick, simple answer, but I think it's important for parents to recognize this. So it feels like there's so much more pressure on teens. I feel old saying this, but like when I was in high school in the 80s, it does feel like the level of pressure was different than what our teens have today. Even just the availability, the sheer number of honors or AP classes that were even available to take, and the expectation of how many you would take, all of that has ramped up. And with each additional advanced level class our kids add to their schedule, they're adding in additional homework generally. They are involved not just in, one activity after school. If they're in sports, now it's often club sports too. And they're involved in multiple extracurriculars, either at school or outside of school. And maybe they have a job too. So when you think about the time commitment from all of these things that they have going on, sometimes they truly are overextended. So one way to kind of help assess this, you can obviously get a sense of it if your kid isn't getting home until 9 at night, and that's the first time they have to eat dinner and finally start studying. That's a clue that perhaps they have a little bit too much. But you can also sort of map it out for, each class they're taking. What's the expected hours of homework per night? Add all that up. There's the hours they're in school. Then there's the hours of homework for each class. Then there's the hours devoted to whatever extracurricular they're doing. Then there's the hours for if they have a job. Then there's the hours just to be able to eat dinner and, sit down for 5 minutes and breathe. So they're not like robotically having to immediately shift from task to task to task. And so if you look at all that and you see that there's not a window of 8 to 10 hours plus some buffer for them to wind down before bed and have a little bit of time to catch their breath, they might be overscheduled, and you might want to consider perhaps paring things down.
Yeah, I think that's a big piece. Yeah, and that's good advice, just to sit down and take a look at the activities, how much time, so create a time sheet and see, where the time goes, what activity takes how much time, and have an honest conversation with an emphasis on prioritizing sleep and the benefits of sleep. But I think oftentimes in families, parents come from this, place of go to bed because you have to get up early, go to bed, and the teen perceives it as control. I think what's missing is the conversation about the ramification of sleep deprivation, the importance of sleep. I think teenagers are smart. If you discuss a piece of article with them or read a book together or a TED Talk, perhaps. I've done that with my daughter, and not coming from this controlling place, but having them think about the issue as well, it's huge. And sometimes teenagers may say, oh, I love my sports, I love my this, I love my that. Yeah, but honey, what are the consequences on your health, on your stress level, on your mental health eventually, right? So I think having those deep conversations and not just saying, no, you can't do this, like the parental attitude and the conversation has to shift as well. I feel like, that's a big piece. When I am in that, state of mind and I have honest conversations with my teen, I get more cooperation and she understands a lot. But if I'm coming from a more controlling place, you have to get off your screen because you have to sleep. It's like you're faced with resistance naturally, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, nobody can sleep on command either. That's the other thing. So, yeah, so that part never quite works. Your point about the parents' attitude is such a key one. It's because sometimes the students themselves will be, the teens themselves are driving this behavior of, oh, I love all these activities. I can't possibly bear to drop one. But there often is also an element of they feel that they need to do it in order to be successful, in order to quote unquote do well and get into a good college. And that may be internalized pressure. It may be pressure that they see among their friends. It may be coming from the school. It may be coming from the parents. It may be coming from all of those areas. And so needing to address that piece too, that in some cases, our teens are overscheduled because they think they have to, that is what's required. And that, God forbid, they take one fewer honors level class, everything will fall apart. And of course, that's not the case. And unfortunately, the risk is that they will fall apart if they are overscheduled to the point where they're chronically sleep deprived.
Yeah, I know. I heard so many suicide cases in my district, which is a very academically oriented and very robust school district. And that should never happen. Children should have free time to just be and socialize and enjoy life a little bit. I mean, they're not just robots, preparing them for the future, taking gold honors classes, and you don't have to be in every club, in any activity. And the sports have become a whole, it's not sports for the sports fun sake. It's also very competitive. And it's like it takes a toll on everyone, on the kids, on the parents. I feel like, wow, we all need to take a step back and relax and reevaluate, like, what are we doing here? We already have devices and technology, social media that is influencing our kids. Can we talk about technology and what kind of suggestions you may have, or what have you seen work or from your research?
Yeah, tech is such a big topic. And again, it's a complicated one, like overscheduling, because you can't just go in and say, drop all your extracurriculars or, stop using tech. I mean, tech obviously is embedded in our lives in a way that it wasn't a generation ago. And that is not going to change. So that, it is here to stay. And it is also not all bad. I think that's the other, sometimes there's this tendency to sort of think, oh, well, tech is the problem. Tech also has some very good aspects to it. Tech is necessary in terms of how our kids are doing their homework, submitting their assignments. They have to be online for that. Just along those lines, there is one piece that schools can look at, which is a pretty simple one, which is what time assignments are due. I found this out when I was talking to a teacher, that often the system will just default to 11:59 p.m. And if the teen sees it's not due to 11:59 p.m., of course, they're going to wait and work on it later in the evening. So that's, why can't assignments be due at 9 p.m.? So that's something that is a way to address the tech aspect. The other piece is when we talk about tech and social media, that is actually really has valuable aspects for our kids in terms of being a key part of their relationships and how they stay in contact with their friends. So when I was in high school, I spent hours on the telephone talking with my friends. That was the technology of choice back then. Teens today really are not talking on the phone. They are online with their friends. It's a key part of how they maintain those social contacts. So we do need to recognize that. That being said, there can also be downsides to that where, we've all heard about the harmful effects of social media. The amount of time that teens are spending online can easily get out of control. And some of that is by design, by the way, that all of these apps were designed to keep people engaged as long as possible. So teens are in some ways the perfect audience for that because their brains are primed for rewards. And, things like video games, leveling up, that's a reward. Things like social media likes, that's a reward. So all these are things that they are responding to that were put in place deliberately for them to respond to. So we sort of have to recognize what they're up against. When it comes to how parents can help, against this tech juggernaut, really, because again, we're all designed to be deliberately immersive. There are common sense guidelines. So for instance, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no tech use an hour before bed. So that is the official recommendation. Now, I know as a parent of a teen, that isn't always super easy to implement, but it's still important to know that that's actually the official guideline and to work towards that, or to recognize that being on your device up until the minute you turn off the light, and even after you turn off the light in many cases, is not conducive to sleep. So things like that. I was mentioning about a wind down routine earlier. So instead of being online, playing a stimulating video game or being embroiled in some chat with a friend or what have you, it's better to not be doing that, to instead be reading an actual book, or go take a bath, or go do something that is calming and helps you wind down. So that's an area where parents can absolutely be talking with their teens, just kind of helping them figure out what are some things that might work for them. And I should also add that for us as adults, this kind of a wind down routine is also so important. Being online, scrolling through news headlines and then turning off the light, that's not really priming us to drift off peacefully to have a good night's sleep.
That's why I was saying, when it comes to influencing teenagers, we have to make shifts as a family, framing it. And, let's take a family challenge. Let's delete all social media, all of us, and see how we do as a family. Let's prioritize sleep. Let's talk about sleep. I find that is a much more effective way of influencing teenagers, because if you're in your bedroom as a parent scrolling or watching Netflix and you're, demanding that your teenager get off their phone, that's not going to happen. So what else I have found, that if we have, listeners who have younger children, implement the rules that we're talking about and some more when it comes to technology before your children turn teenagers, because it's a lot easier to maintain the rules than to sort of, create new rules as your child ages. I find that whatever rules that I have created around screen time when my daughter first got her phone, we still have the same rules. And I am so happy that I did that work ahead of time, and I don't have to, make changes now, because it would never work. It would be so an uphill battle fighting with your teenagers, saying, no phone in your bedroom. That's one of my rules. My daughter has downtime on her phone, 1 hour before bed, no screen time. Those rules we instilled when she was younger, and it's so easy to maintain, as opposed to like instilling them now when they are teenagers and they hit the free reign. It's like so hard. So I think my advice is for parents of younger kids, be wise and think forward and implement rules that are going to help your child and your family in the future. So with teenagers, unfortunately, I'm not sure. Like, what would you suggest? What would you add to this?
Yeah, no, I think that is such good advice, that you want to have these kind of guidelines in place from the beginning, because it is much easier to adapt them as you move forward than it is to suddenly implement them. However, that it's not always the case that people have had the best case scenarios always in place, in which case it probably is going to be a little bit more of a process, because you're not just going to implement rules overnight and have them be successfully and cheerfully adhered to. So having a discussion with your teen, it gets back to, as you were talking about, one of the key pieces is making sleep a family priority. So having it be something that we as adults are modeling, in terms of the fact that we make our own sleep a priority, that we are attempting to get the required amount of sleep, again, which for us is 7 to 9 hours, that we are winding down before bed, that we are not on our phones, in bed, that our teens are seeing that we are indeed modeling these behaviors. So that's one key piece. Having it be a discussion, so it is something where the teen can have buy-in and can help provide their own input, asking them to try, figuring out one change that they might want to make and seeing how that goes. It's sort of going to be a little bit of a longer process, and definitely one that's going to involve them more if you don't already have these guidelines in place. But again, when we're modeling those behaviors, and especially as you've done, if you've already set them in place that's great. So things like not having devices in bedrooms at night is also what's recommended by groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics. So that means ideally having a central charging station. So maybe that's in the kitchen, and that means everyone's phones go there overnight to get charged, including the parents. So things like that help make it easier, I think, so that it's something that's consistent for all family members. And if the phones are being used in the rooms as alarm clocks, you go out and you get alarm clocks. So, figuring out like what are those little stumbling blocks that are pretty easy to surmount.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Change has to happen on a family level. We can't be hypocrites. I feel like with teenagers, especially, that's not going to work. I mean, obviously, I told you before the interview that we also, this is an issue in our household. Sleep. My daughter likes to sleep. She's often late to school, and this is a big issue. And I'm really passionate about this topic. And I have had a conversation with her one day in which I said, "Are you concerned about this, that this is a problem, the not getting enough sleep and being late?" She said, "Yes, of course." I think that's number one. Parents need to know that children feel that this is a problem too, and having that conversation first. And then I asked my daughter, what do you think you could do to make bedtime go smoothly and so that you can wake up early and on time? And honestly, she enlisted 7 things. And going to bed early was not one of them. So I think having really honest conversations with your teenagers, because we have fixed ideas as parents. If you go to bed early, you'll get up early. That doesn't work. I think really being curious and involving the teen in the process, I can't emphasize the importance of that. And having them participate in the solving of the problem that concerns them. It's a problem for us too, but it's a problem for them too. They feel that it's a problem for them too. And
Absolutely.
yeah. So what could you share from your personal experience with your daughter when the sleep time in California changed? Did you face obstacles in regards to going to bed late or sleep deprivation? Did it solve issues? Can you say from your experience?
I think, well, I should mention, so I have 2 kids. My son was the one whose entrance into high school in 2015 prompted this. My daughter entered high school 2019, and so then COVID, ate away almost half of her high school year, or her high school experience, I should say. It was, gosh, I can't even remember now how long, we were in online school, which was quite some time. So obviously that was yet another factor of, that our kids had to deal with these last few years, all the stress of COVID, the mental health implications. When she did go back in person, though, after all that, our school had switched to the 8:30 start time. And absolutely, that was so much better. She certainly was not somebody who was able to wake early and eagerly for a 7:30 start time. 8:30 was far better. And in that regard, she's, very similar to so many other teens out there. There aren't really very many people in their teenage years who like having to get up at the crack of dawn and to be at school at 7:30, or in some cases, even earlier. When I was doing the research and looking at start times, I found in California even, and in other states, there were schools that started at 7:30 or some as early as 7 o'clock. And that's mandatory first period. Those weren't optional 0 periods. And that, when you think about having to do that on a daily basis, just how much that wears you down. So I think this gets back to why I see statewide legislation ultimately as the way to address this, as opposed to every single community having to make the change on an individual basis.
And when teenagers arrive so early to school, even though, let's say, they can get up, doesn't mean necessarily they are alert and ready to learn and process information. It's like, no, they're barely surviving. They want to fall asleep. Their brains are foggy. So it's like, it's not useful. This is not serving them.
That is so true. And I'm sort of laughing because when I was writing the book, I was, researching and talking to various people. One of them was a teacher who talked about, kids literally falling asleep in class and how much she had to work to be extra peppy in those early morning classes, that the onus was on the teachers to keep the kids awake, because they do often in those early morning classes have kids who are literally falling asleep. And even the ones who aren't, they're kind of like zombies. They're sitting there, their eyes are open, but it's not like the information is being absorbed. So that's such a key point, because when it comes to school, that is literally the point. They should be there so they can learn. And when they're sleep deprived, it hampers that entire process of learning, acquiring the new information while they're sitting there, in school, or trying to read, their textbooks afterwards, retaining that information, because that whole process is what happens during sleep. That's when our brain is synthesizing all of the information we've gathered over the course of the day and moving it from short-term storage into long-term storage. So obviously, if you're not getting enough sleep, that's not happening to an optimal level. And then the third piece of it is being able to retrieve the information that you've learned. So you go in to take a test, or you're trying to remember what you learned in school so you can do your homework. If you're sleep deprived, you're going to have trouble doing that. So absolutely, it can be self-defeating. You have kids who are physically there. Are they learning to an optimal level? No.
Yeah. And also, when you're sleep deprived, I want to add something to this. When a person or a teenager is sleep deprived, it's a stressor for the body. So when your body is under stress all the time, you don't make the best choices in food. So your body craves naturally fat, sugar, and carbs. So because you are experiencing this stress as a result of sleep deprivation, you gravitate towards junk food. So you put your junk food into your body, which is not conducive to your health. You can't pay attention. You don't sleep well. You don't eat well. And of course, it doesn't make you feel great. And especially for teenagers, feeling great about themselves, their self-image, self-esteem is a big one during teenage years. So it all ties into their health, physical health, mental health. I think sleep is so fundamental and foundational. Like if we can really help our teenagers get more sleep, like you said, on a family level, and on a legislative level, state level, by implementing early school times, wow, it would be such an amazing thing. What I want to ask you about, and we're approaching the end of our conversation here, maybe this is the last question, gender differences. I found that pretty interesting. Can you say a few words about that when it comes to sleep, getting sleep?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I have a whole chapter in my book called Not All Teens Sleep the Same, because this is so important, this whole aspect of sleep disparities. And there is so much to say about this, because there are these differences, not just related to gender and more specifically biological sex, but also to race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic factors, all of which can further impact sleep. But when it comes to girls and women, it has to do with biological sex, because a lot of this has to do with hormones. It has to do with the menstrual cycle. So unfortunately, girls and women tend to sleep worse than males. And this split starts to become apparent at puberty. It was interesting because I talked to various researchers about this. And up until that point, they don't really see meaningful differences, but they do start to see this split at puberty. The split being that girls tend to develop a higher risk for insomnia and also tend to start taking longer to fall asleep. And then, of course, there is the monthly menstrual cycle, which is something that I think, so often gets dismissed, but it is a real factor affecting girls and women for years, as we know. And certainly as women, there are aspects of it then having to do not just with pregnancy, but perimenopause and menopause, but just the monthly menstrual cycle itself. You can get premenstrual syndrome, you can get cramps, you can get bloating, you can become more irritable, all of which can impact your ability to get a good night's sleep. The other key piece, just to underline how prevalent this is that by age 12 in the US, about half of all girls have already gotten their period. So this is, what age 12 is, what is that, seventh grade? I mean, and of course, that's already half. So we're really talking girls as young as, still in grade school, this can be impacting in terms of sleep. So I think that is so key to keep in mind. Other disparities, as I mentioned, for kids who identify as LGBTQ+, and largely due to discrimination they may face, they tend to sleep worse. Same, there are differences by race and ethnicity, oftentimes driven by discrimination. I mean, I'm covering this in such broad strokes here. I I'm not giving it, the level of attention here it deserves. So I would just remind your listeners of that. There's so much more to say about all this, but also socioeconomic factors. I think we touched on earlier, hunger. If you're going to bed hungry, you're not going to be sleeping as well. So any of these can be additional complicating factors above and beyond all the other ones we've already talked about. So just yet more things that may be complicating our teens' ability to get a good night's sleep.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lisa, for writing the book, for your advocacy work. I know the way you present, you're very humble, but you had a big role in this law that has been implemented in California. So I applaud your efforts and really inspired by you as a woman, as a writer, as a passionate advocate.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it so much. Yeah, I wish you good luck. We'll stay in touch. And I have links to all of your articles in the New York Times, or maybe the op-ed that you mentioned that got the attention of that person. And of course, links to your book, which is really wonderful. We didn't even go in depth. I think every parent of a teenager needs to read this book. Every teenager needs to read this book. And I said, you have to write a book for teenagers.
Right.
So thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener. And I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it useful. As the school year is about to begin, we're trying to get our children to bed on time so that they can wake up on a timely manner and get to school. I love hearing from you. I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail, which I am being honest, I really prefer. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a voice note. If you want to connect with your fellow listeners from around the world, engage in meaningful conversation about the show, get support and answers to your parenting questions, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for people like you. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Your ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. And of course, if you love the podcast and find it helpful, show your support by making a donation. Go to authenticparenting.com/support. Your contribution makes a difference. Thank you for your generosity and your kindness. As always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seawold. Thank you so much for listening.